Do you sometimes feel distant from the Lord, like Mary did coming to the tomb? As we go through all the struggles of life, most of us seem to arrive at distant times. We're far from the quietness of seeing Jesus in the garden on resurrection morning, like Mary. We slowly drift away from the gracious assurances Jesus offered to Mary. So much of Christ's ministry, if you remember, was always going to where his disciples were and reminding them of what he'd already said. That was what Jesus did for about 3.5 years. He went around and kept reminding the disciples. And from the manger to the cross, Jesus had been for 33 years in only one place at a time. And that's a thought I want you to think about this morning. What exactly did the resurrection accomplish? Now, I know that it was God's ratification of the new covenant. I know that Jesus had conquered death. I know that he stepped out of the tomb. But a lot of times we just leave it there. And we forget one simple thing, that up until Jesus rose on resurrection morning, Jesus, for 33 years, for 3.5 years of his earthly ministry, for 30 years of his personal life before he started in ministry, Jesus could only be in one place at one time. Have you ever thought about that? I mean, when you read the Gospels, have you thought about that? Jesus, because he emptied himself at his incarnation, limited himself, he was localized and he operated in only one place at a time. Now, it's kind of hard to believe when you read the Gospels. I mean, for 3 years, Jesus awesomely served in the power of God. Wherever Jesus went, his presence made sure that death fled and diseases faded and despair melted. And any broken bodies that came into contact with Jesus got mended. And any ruined lives were repaired, and sightless eyes were restored, and empty ears were filled with sound. And those missing fingers had them return, and hungering lives were satisfied. That's what Jesus did. And everywhere he went, wherever he was, whenever he was there, his presence meant that death and disease and despair were no more. But Jesus did that in only one place at a time. Think of that. Crowds would come to him. Multitudes would flock to him. And no one was ever disappointed. He helped them all. But sometimes the crowds were so great that people were pressed out and had to resort to digging down through rooftops or climbing up into treetops or reaching down through the feet of the crowd just to grab the tassel of his robe. And all of this because he was just one person. And he was limited to being in one place at a time. But now I've said that so many times, I think you're catching it this morning, right? Jesus, prior to stepping out of the tomb on resurrection morn, was limited to being in one place at a time. And if you couldn't get to where he was, then you couldn't get whatever it was you needed from him. Amazing to think about. But as we step into the garden, in John chapter 20 and verse 11, that surrounds the borrowed tomb on resurrection morning, something has wondrously changed. Jesus is no longer trapped by time and space to be in one place at a time. In fact, from John 20 and verse 18 onward, he seems to be everywhere at once. For the next 40 days, Jesus crisscrosses the tiny land of Israel from north to south. We find him on top of mountains, on back roads, inside locked rooms, on the shores of the Sea of Galilee, and everywhere else that anybody was looking for him. He just showed up. He walked through the walls. He walked through the doors. He showed up in the night. He was everywhere. He meets the grieving women at the tomb. He comforts the sorrowing Mary. He calms the frightened disciples inside a locked room without even opening the door. He shows up at dawn on the shores of the Sea of Galilee to restore Peter and confronts him, soaking wet, as he dragged ashore after swimming to see Jesus. He comes to a doubtful, trembling Thomas. He visits with every one of the 500 others who believed on him, as 1 Corinthians 15 says. And he does all that in an occupied country, crawling with spies, filled with soldiers, and with a whole army of religious leaders that were filled with hatred. And for 40 days after the empty tomb, Jesus was not even seen once by any unloving eyes. Did you ever think of that? No one else saw him. He came and went, and only those who loved him saw him. He was never touched by anything but loving hands. And he was in his presence available unstoppably everywhere. Now think about resurrection morning again. And think about the fact that the empty tomb meant something had changed. And what had changed was Christ's availability. Now a lot of people say, oh, I wish I would have lived back then. I mean, I would have been able to see him. With 30,000 people crowded in front of you, unless you climbed a tree or got on your hands and knees, you probably wouldn't have. Because no one knew just where he was. They just kind of wandered around searching for him. But something changed. For 3.5 years, anyone who could find him could have any need met, any fear removed, any oppression lifted, any chain broken, any defilement cleansed away. But only if you could find him. Jesus solved all problems by his presence. Jesus came to people where they were and one by one transformed them. But only in one place at a time. And all that has changed. And this morning we celebrate that Jesus is now available anywhere and everywhere. That's what the resurrection's all about. That Jesus is no longer bound by time and space. He's not localized into that little postage stamp size piece of ground called the land of Israel. He is now everywhere with anyone that seeks him.